Poppets, come connect the dots. Come connect the dots with me, Poppets. Come connect the dots. It's so beautiful.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Poppets Poets, disconnecting the dots of language. We're led by your host, Professor Poet Robyn joined by our guest Joe Kane. I'll turn it over to them so they can guide us through some verse.
Alrighty, well, you ready to get started?
I sure am. Let's dive in.
Okay, alright. Well, hi, welcome to our very first, our inaugural podcast of Poppets and Poets, disconnecting the dots of language. And I'm here with Joe Kane. And so, Joe, I was wondering if you'd be interested in introducing yourself to our audience.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Robyn. I'm excited to chat today. It's been fun to sort of go down a reading about and thinking about imagism rabbit hole a little bit over the last couple days. It's been a while. But first off, who I am. Joe Kane. I am a poet, and I've done a lot of poetry-related things, I guess. The big thing now is that I'm the director of youth programs for the Porch Writers Collective, which is a Nashville literary nonprofit. And so we do all kinds of stuff, but the part that I'm involved in, mostly the youth programs, we have all kinds of writing workshops and events for people third grade and up. And we actually, even though I mostly write poetry, I write other things as well. And our workshops, we do a lot of poetry, but we do a lot of fiction and nonfiction, even things like podcasting and music journalism. So we kind of explore all kinds of writing with people all over the city.
Oh, that's awesome. So at least one of us is familiar with the podcast medium.
We have a podcast we co-create with NPR called Versify, where poets sit down one-on-one with people and hear a story from that person's life, and then create a poem inspired by the story, and give it to the person on the spot. So that's been a lot of fun, and because of that connection, we've had a really talented reporter from NPR kind of come and do some crash course podcasting workshops for some of our teams. That's been a lot of fun.
That's
sort of
so cool.
Get the insider tips about editing and interviewing and just different things about how to handle microphones, stuff like that. So.
Oh, that's really cool. Well, we'll have to look out for that. Maybe, I'll take a class on podcasting from you guys now that I'm making podcasts.
You should. And we are, I know things are all crazy now, but we have been moving all of our stuff online. So keep an eye out on that inbox or sign up for our newsletters, because adult and youth programs are all going to be available on Zoom in the very near future. So.
Oh, definitely. I will make a link to everything that the Porch is up to, as well as everything that Slants is up to, available with a copy of this recording. So that's really cool. Thank you so much, Joe.
Yeah. And for anyone so I know, Robyn, you already know about Porch programs and stuff. So just for anyone listening, Slant is the name of the Porch's youth program. So we have a sort of a separate identity for the youth stuff, but it's a part of the Porch. Slant stands for Student Literary Artists of Nashville, Tennessee, and it's just the name we give to any of the programs that are for people 18 and under.
Well, yeah, tell the truth and tell it Slant. So that's a really...
I know. The Dickinson reference.
A meaning other than that sort of confession that I had behind it. So it's really cool.
Yeah, we had a little. We our founding members like what they wanted in a name, and they all liked acronyms. So we need to come up with a good acronym for them. So.
Well, I really appreciate you doing this and being so patient with me as I've been gathering all this material together. But again, we're doing this just to sort of remind each other, especially now while we're participating in social distancing, of the humanity that's out there, and especially the humanity that's behind poetry. And so I think that we should begin maybe. And I was so excited to hear that you actually had curated 3 poems that are, in a sense, Imagist poems. So it works perfectly because we're transitioning from Imagism last week, and now we're getting into both Imagism as well as like concrete poetry. And can we sort of create a unity behind those two different poems, those 2 different forms or types or schools of poetry? So do you want to kick us off with our very first original Joe Kane poem?
Yeah, I would love to.
If there's a story behind it, if you'd like to tell us something about it afterwards, I'd love to hear the story.
Yeah. So when you sent me the reading material for our conversation, you sort of mentioned maybe I might be interested in reading an original poem. Usually when people ask me, I do a lot of readings and stuff. So usually when people ask me if I want to read something, I have a handful of poems that are easy to return to and kind of read often because I'm used to them. They're familiar and I know how they're going to go. But then when I was, reading about just getting reacquainted with Imagism and some of the poems that we were going to be looking at for this, it really reminds me of some poems that I wrote a while ago. So really I wrote these when I was a freshman in college, so I'd probably be about the age of some of your students, maybe a little younger.
Oh, yeah.
And, but I think that without knowing to call them Imagist poems, just the way that I was approaching poetry at that time, and even the way that I still do now, had a very sort of Imagist quality. So we're going to dive into talking about what Imagism is in a little bit, but I thought these were great examples of that. So I'm just going to start off with this one called, they're all pretty short poems. I'm going to start with this one called I-75, after the freeway.
Okay.
So, I saw a truck hiding in the weeds. Its gray body, not without luster, crouched, like a small child waiting to be sought. Eyes sliding slowly over me as I drive by. Low beams.
Beautiful.
And that's it.
That's beautiful. I love the gray body, not without luster. It's so cool because Freud actually refers to women as the dark continent, right? Because I don't know if I'm ready to explore ladies because they're creepy.
Yeah.
But as a freshman as a undergraduate, I actually used to sign some of my poetry as Robyn Lear, the dark gray continent. And so it's gray body, not without luster. It reminds me so much of like the image that was evoked for me, at least like when I learned that of Freud, and how it's the body, but it still has this essence and also this beauty, even though it's sort of in a sense abandoned. So that's what I thought of as soon as I saw that line.
Yeah, and it was just, I think it's as Imagist a story as you can get. I was seriously just driving down the freeway on the way to visit my grandparents who live in rural Michigan, and I just saw this truck. I was driving by, and I wrote this poem without stopping. I probably was not super responsible, but I wrote it while still on the freeway, and because there's just something about just the image of that truck that really stuck with me, and as we'll sort of see, sometimes I feel like images stick with me because they have there's just something especially striking about them. Sometimes because they have a metaphorical significance to me, or they're or an emotional resonance that is like going on with something else in my life. But sometimes I'm not entirely sure why they do. They just sometimes the image is enough. It's the whole thing. And I think that this is one of those times where it felt like something that I wanted to write down, and I didn't really have a real reason, but it had just stayed with me enough that I wanted to return to it. So.
No, it's beautiful. And I think that, again, I'm not condoning writing while driving, but we are also, we're tasked with keeping a journal. And so I think there's something to be said, that you never know when the inspiration for a poem is going to kind of come upon you. And so it happens almost instantaneously sometimes. And so making time to actually write it down and record it is what then gives it that sort of permanence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think something that we've been dealing with a lot, and I think a lot of what young writers are dealing with is that anxiety of having to write down a bad poem, right? And so I think that once you become so sort of practiced in making that time to write down the poem, you sort of get out of your own way, and so you could be so accustomed to transitioning thought and imagination onto the page that you could just maybe write a poem while you're driving down the road.
Absolutely. I've heard a lot of artists of all types, like visual artists, songwriters, and writers, talk about how the worst thing they could do is have an idea and let it go. Because if they have an idea, even if it turns out to be a total crap song or sketch or whatever that they never do anything with, but if they start letting ideas go, then they get into the headspace of observing things and letting them go. But if you are in the practice of just putting things down and engaging with your ideas right when you have them, then both you're just in that space where you're ready to capture, the right spark when it hits you, but also you kind of train yourself to be on the lookout for things a little more. I think so. And I think this was a time in my life when I was in one of my first creative writing classes, and I was just in the practice of trying to look around me and write about things a lot. And another day, I might have just driven right by and not thought anything of it.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, that you'd been trained almost to see the metaphor of your surroundings. And so then you had to write it down. That's so cool. Yeah. I never thought about that, how that maybe my perception was altered after being taught that it was okay to have that perception.
Yeah.
That's cool. Yeah.
I don't think it's training necessarily in a formal sense of that you have to need to know about the history of poetry or anything like that, but more like you said, a permission, more like having yourself be in the habit of engaging with your environment in that way.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I wanted to go back with what you were talking about as far as images poetry and how it just sort of obviously it's common to study this genre of poetry. Especially, I think especially when you're young. I remember the first time I read William Carlos Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow, and I was like, are you kidding me? Which is why I still to this day don't assign that poem, and why I assign This Is Just Say by Williams, because for me it's just as evocative looking at the poetic theory essay that we've been reading, which is Preface to Some Images by Amy Lowell. So I was just going to point out a couple of interesting passages that I saw from the essay, which is probably, first, right, number one, to use the language of common speech, but to employ always the exact word, not the nearly exact nor the merely decorative word. And what do you think that means?
That's a great question. It's interesting. I think I was reading through this list, and it's been I've read this a long time ago, and I feel like these ideas have been very present in my mind still since then. But to return to them on purpose has been an interesting journey. But just I think with that, the returning to the exact word, or finding the exact word without just decoration, I think it really gets to this. I know that they're reacting against some of the romantic poets, right? And romantic poets, just like the extra flowery speech, and then also, some of those other points kind of get to this, but like really formalist poets who made really like the strict form of the poem the thing. But I think that it kind of comes down to a philosophy of like what you want to represent in a poem, and just like an aesthetic choice of what do you find beautiful. So I think a lot of the Imagist poets write about everyday moments, and they find everyday moments beautiful. They're not writing about these like Greek myths and kind of. So I think a lot of romanticism is like trying really hard, and I'm a romantic guy, in general. So it's not against like being romantic in life, but romanticism, the movement, a lot of it is just like this bending over backwards to get overly flowery, and it's kind of like that perfume that's too much.
Right.
That's too much. I would rather fall in love with someone who smelled like they were cooking potatoes.
Oh,
I would rather a hash brown love than someone with like gallons of perfume and rose petals that you're walking on. So I think
that's beautiful. I would rather a hash brown love too.
So I think that's what it comes down to is kind of, and we'll see it in the examples I think that we're gonna read. Is it's not any less luxuriating in language. I think Imagist poets, when they say use everyday language, they still find that exactness. They find a way to put the words together in a way that is still, an experience of beauty. Still not
definitely.
They're not rushing to meaning. They're using language as a delicious experience, but it's just as we look at the lines,
language, like how simple can I make language, and how little language can I use to where the line or verse still has that sense of meaning, if that makes sense. But not being so overwrought, which is I definitely like. I very much like appreciate you mentioning the difference between romanticism and then imagism, which is a school of modernism. And it's interesting that that we're looking at the simplicity and the almost like stripped bareness that we see in Imagist poetry, because romanticism is arguably when we see common language first being used, but it is that sort of like overly emotional, sort of overly sentimental take on what would be common that we would be able able to sort of relate to. But then we get to imagism, and imagism is where we're sort of acknowledging what is common, what is easy to comprehend, but we're doing it with as little, not as little, sort of, what am I trying to say? This is the story of my life. What am I trying to say? Oh, but with as little sort of our own, we're getting our own sort of self-interest, our own ego out of the way, and we're observing the image for what it is, and seeing how that image can become also what is beyond it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great point you bring up about romanticism still like dealing with the everyday, and it seems like the thing, and I think Lowell expresses it in this preface, even if it's in sort of a roundabout way. But it's just that I feel like with romanticism, you have people who are like, okay, well, let's take a look at everyday life, but then they use all this flowery language because it's almost like they're trying to justify, the everyday life. Yeah, they're like, we need to go out of our way to prove that everyday life is worth examining, whereas the imagists are just like, no, just here's the thing by itself is all the proof you need, is all the justification you need, and they don't go out of their way to explain, why they're writing about it. And I like that a lot more because I feel like as a reader, I can engage with that on a deeper level. It leaves room for me to return to a poem and to, engage with it on a different emotional level the different times that I read it. And I think as a writer, it's very much an act of faith, imagism and letting people sort of step into the space that you create with the image and then fill that space with their own emotional reaction is very much an act of faith because you don't have control over how people are going to react to it. And,
definitely.
And I think
I love how you keep going. Sorry, I'll stop interrupting.
I was just going to say that I think that's a lovely. It could be a frightening thing for some people, but I think that's a lovely way to approach writing, and I think that's what ends up in the end having the most rewarding experience for a reader.
I love that you keep talking about how like it can come back up over and over in the mind, and I thought it was really funny when we were talking about how we were going to set this up, that This Is Just to Say was one that came back to you over and over again, and the Anecdote in the Jar is one that that poem comes back to me so frequently. I think about it almost every time I go for a walk or a hike, that it's like, oh man, I come back to that image and what he's getting at there, and it just still to this day blows my mind, and I still enjoy it. And maybe it is because of its simplicity, but then also the like deep complexity that goes within that simplicity that I continue to want to come back to it again and again.
Well, can we read This Is Just to Say, and then maybe talk more? I mean, I want to talk more about some of the things in the Lowell preface. Yeah. So, like, it's so short. Maybe we could read This Is Just to Say, and then come back to it, like you said.
Oh yeah, I'd love that. Do you want to read it?
I do. I love this poem so much. So it is one of the ones that I reread again and again. So this is just to say, I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold.
Oh, the way that it's so funny. I love listening to you read this poem because it is so perfectly simple, and when I read this poem, and I'm going to read it now because I want you to hear how I read this poem.
Yeah, please do. I love hearing multiple interpretations in different voices.
This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, in which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious, so sweet, and so cold. And I like to that's why sensuality I feel so much when I read this poem, and then also just you son of a bitch.
Yeah. I always imagine that this is a note left on. I mean, it's a predate sticky notes, but it was a note left on the fridge or left on the kitchen table, and it does. So it has such a little just a note to my partner or my wife quality to it. That's sort of a simple everyday moment, but it does get to the so sweet and so cold. Does get to that. I imagine this was a note written at 1 a.m. when you go to the fridge and you just have that the house is quiet and it's late at night and you're just gonna have a moment with something sweet, and then even if you know you shouldn't, you just don't care.
Oh, I know, just, right? This is mine right now, and I need this.
Yeah, you're just I'm just here on my own, and I'm happy to be alive, eating these plums, and then it's at once sort of. I mean, it's an apology, but not an apology.
Oh no!
And it's also it's I feel like it's at once an act of taking selfishly, but then the thinking of the person to give them the poem is also an act of sharing. It's I know I'm stealing this, but I'm going to share a little of the experience with you. Not to mean it's not selfish, but just I love how it's inhabiting all these different little things. So.
Yeah, definitely, and how we can feel all these different things from just this one, one small work. What's really interesting to me is that a lot of my students, when they read this, they're really, Miss Lear, how is this a poem? I feel I leave these types of things for my husband or for my wife or for my roommates all the time, and I never looked at that and was oh, that's a poem. And so what would you say if somebody had that reaction to this work?
I would say, I mean, people could ask that of any art, and I would say, firstly, I fully support the idea that anything can be art if someone who created it says it is.
Mm-hmm.
That's different from saying anything can be good art. I fully defend, that someone says anything can be a poem. Absolutely. That's not saying everything is a good poem. So I think the real question is, why is this a poem that has stood the test of time, that people continue to engage with? And I think it's just so wonderfully captures a little moment that feels so familiar to us that even if we don't, even if we're not dating someone, or even if we don't like plums, we've all had that little moment of just saying yes to sweetness in our life.
Oh, that's beautiful, yeah.
And so it's at once very familiar, but it's also very specific. It's not using broad terms to make vague statements about love and taking and receiving, and it's very rooted to a little moment in time. And then it does something that short poems do very well, which is it lets itself be a small moment, and then because it's so short, it'll just sort of stay in your mind and just come back to you, whether or not you ask it to. And so I bet even a lot of people who read it the first time and they're I don't get it, why is this a poem? It might come back to them the next week. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they automatically love it, but it stays with you.
Yes, definitely.
I think this is definitely a perfect example of, the Imagist idea of using me what to feel about it. And for that reason,
keep going. Sorry.
I would say, like, that's what allowed you to read it very differently than I did.
Yeah, well, for me, anytime I see a plum or a peach, I'm automatically like, oh my gosh, that is a sexy fruit. And like, I think we know, like, we're familiar with the peach as being a more, like, sort of, like, sexually charged symbol than we are with the plum because of, sex messaging. And so we're not going to get into that anymore. But, like, the plum carries that same sort of, like, symbolic meaning for me. And so this, like, I'm sorry I have eaten the plums. Like, I'm sorry that I tasted this fruit that you were saving for yourself.
Yeah.
And then he says at the end, forgive me, they were delicious. And it's like, how is that an apology? I think it's like the perfect.
It's like I know I did it, but I'm not sorry.
Yeah. They were delicious. And it's like, hell yeah, they were delicious. Because plums, when they're actually ripe and ready to eat, and they're at that, like, perfect pinnacle of sweetness, so much so that she was like, maybe, or not she, but, they were saving that plum until at that moment, and then our speaker eats it before they get to enjoy it. But they were delicious, so sweet, and so cold.
Interesting. I usually imagine. Oh, go ahead.
No, like, perfect for me, and then also, like, that's what this type of apology is.
Yeah, absolutely. Essentially, I usually imagine this is a note written to somebody who you've been with for a long time, like, a wife of many years or something like that, and or a partner of many years, and it's the kind of thing that they're going to be like, oh, really? But it's not like you're getting in a huge fight over it necessarily. That being said, as much as I think of it usually as this sort of a little note in a relationship that you've had for a long time, just pro tip for anyone listening: if you ever want to date a poet, give them this poem.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Like, this is a key to a poet's heart. Like, I think one time I borrowed someone's pen in a writing class, and then I gave it back to them with, like, a revised version of this, which is like this is just to say I took your pen or something like that, and we dated for 9 months. So it's just.
Oh, that is a pro tip then, right?
Yeah, this is any poet will have a hard time saying no to this is just to say.
And that brings me back to the Images preface again, right? The to allow absolute freedom in choice of subjects. And this poem, so much so, it embodies that, right? To where Williams, it doesn't care if you perceive this as a poem or not, but that it is his sense of a poem. And so it is the ultimate freedom of choice of subject.
Absolutely. And I mean, the same thing with again, this is one of the reasons why I was like, oh, this one I wrote about the truck is good. Just that you don't need to. Again, going back to that, not needing to justify why the thing should be a poem, just that it was a little moment for you as a writer that stood out to you, and then you're just sharing that moment. It's the gift of a moment.
It is a gift of a moment.
Yeah, I like to do that with, in poetry, but also just in correspondence. Like, you know how you'll have times when you maybe have a friend you haven't seen in a long time, and you can, start messaging them, but it's easy to be like, oh, what's been happening? And you can't really sum up what's been happening over the last 6 months or a year. And so it turns into a really boring conversation of like, oh, well, my job, my family, But instead, I like to just gift someone a moment from my day. Instead of trying to capture the last 6 months, I'll just be like, today, right now, this thing. And I think that's just a nicer way of keeping in touch. And I'll ask people the same thing. I'll say what's been on your mind today? Or what was your morning like this morning, even if we haven't talked in a long time?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it does it reconnects you to that, sense of intimacy, and you don't have to, feel disconnected. That's cool. That's cool. Fun fact.
I'm curious
for living
what other...
a better life.
I'm curious what other parts of the Lowell essay stood out to you?
The only part that I was really interested in, that's a perfect segue for getting into Swan and Shadow, and my argument on Swan and Shadow is the subject of free verse. So she writes, the subject of free verse is too complicated to be discussed here. We may briefly that we attach the term to all that increasing amount of writing whose cadence is more marked, more definite, and closer knit than that of prose, but which is not so violently nor so obviously accented as the so-called regular verse. And so just looking at what her concept, or how she's very briefly sort of starting to argue what the purpose or how free verse should be utilized. And so this is sort of where I can then begin to see how concrete poetry, in a sense, can be related to images poetry. But what do you think, Joe? What would you argue is what is essentially free verse, and how do we employ it? And then would we say that concrete poetry is it free verse, or is it maybe more of an even more strict form poem than some other form?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
That's a good question. It's interesting that this is written at a time when people were feeling like they needed to justify free verse, which is now almost the opposite. Oftentimes people feel they need to justify using end rhyme in a poem these days. But I think for me, the whole idea of free verse is just is very similar to what you're saying about the freedom of subject. Freedom of subject is just, I find this poetic and lovely, so I'm going to share it. And I think free verse is just the license to say, I think these sounds are lovely, or I think this rhythm of talking is lovely, and I don't need to justify it with a super ordered structure like a sonnet, or a certain number of metered syllables in a line. And I think that there's some wonderful things that can come from form, and people who do formal poetry well, I think it can be really beautiful. And I'm not against rhyme in poems at all, but there's a lot of instances of people obeying the form more than creating something beautiful. They're writing, they're just throwing in extra words to fit the meter. You can tell they're just itching to get to that rhyme at the end of the line. It's almost like the rest of the words are filler,
Yeah.
So I feel like for me, the free verse, a lot of times people, I think, have faced the argument that free verse is sort of less work, that it's more wishy-washy, I guess you could just throw any words on the page you want. And it's really kind of more just the freedom to create a poem in any way that you find beautiful. But then you still, within that freedom, you have to do the work of finding the right language. So just like it says in number 1 the exact word, and the exact word, and then they talk also about rhythm. So it's the exact word in the exact order.
Yeah.
And without a roadmap to tell you how to do it. So I think that's, in fact, even more challenging often than to just be able to follow a strict form and say, okay, I've completed a poem now because I have X number of lines.
I totally agree. I think, you get into the concept of, radical freedom. I could do anything I want, and that's in a sense, it's kind of terrifying. I actually like the argument that we've been making a lot, that's becoming more prevalent recently, that we don't call it free verse anymore, because free verse implies that it's free and easy, but instead it's become free form. So it's open, but yet there's still the essence of form, right? And that structure can be just as sort of difficult to navigate as it is, sort of free of any sort of, understood rules.
And one thing that, and this sort of connects to kind of the idea of concrete poetry and the swan, is one thing that happens when you give people complete freedom in form is that people will create their own restrictions.
Yeah.
Like when you're like, all right, you can do absolutely anything. People will make their own boxes to put their thoughts into, just so you can have a way of organizing, and also as like a creative challenge. So I think concrete poetry is where, and again, I don't know if you guys have talked about this or not. So concrete poetry just being a thing where the shape of the lines on the page forms some type of image or picture, often related to what the poem is talking about. But I think that couldn't be born until you gave someone the freedom to say, do whatever you want. It'd be hard to write. You could write a concrete poem, I guess, that follows a formal structure, but it would be in a way a betrayal of what the formal structure is supposed to be. So it's more of, and so I think concrete poetry is one of the biggest examples of times when you give people freedom, and they're like, all right, well, I'm going to restrict myself, and it's a very interesting way. It's just like I have to put things on the page in a certain way.
Definitely.
There's a lot of lesser examples of that too. Just people who get started and they're like, okay, well, every stanza in this free verse poem was going to be 4 lines. Why? They don't need it to be, but they've just given themselves that structure to follow so that they can have a little bit of a guideline to create within.
Oh yeah, I actually like something that I've been doing a lot recently. For some reason, I keep coming back to John Berryman's dream songs, and sometimes that scares me, but sometimes I'm all right with it. And so I've been finding myself writing a lot of 6-line stanza poems with 3 stanzas with 6 lines. And then because I don't want to conform to Berryman, I add a final line as to sort of depart. But it gives me a sort of sense to work within freely, and then I can follow whether or not is this actually done at the 6th line, or is this meant to be the 6th line, and am I limiting myself? So that's something that I've found myself doing sometimes when I sit down to write. And our class is actually, they're tasked with writing 1 form poem a week. And so you get to experience that sort of transition between structure and then emotional freedom of form. So it is, for me, concrete poetry is definitely, it's definitely free verse poetry, or it's free form poetry. But it would be when I look at Swan and Shadow, it blows my mind every time. I was like, how did he create this very beautiful and balanced film? You know?
Yes, I mean, should we? I feel like we should probably move on to some of our other poems.
Yeah.
I wanted to point out one thing in here though that for me was also a real essential part of these sort of ideas of imagism. So I think people really focus a lot on the common speech and the exact word, but there's a lot in here also about rhythm and cadence.
Yeah.
So they kind of talk. I've heard it. This one line especially got to me. So if someone's not familiar with the word cadence, it's just sort of like the rising and falling of rhythm. So songs have a cadence where the natural verse rises and falls, but also like our voices have a cadence when we're just having a conversation, where you can kind of tell where I'm at the end of a thought because my cadence winds down.
Yeah.
Whether you're writing in like a formal poem, the cadence is very strict. It's the meter. And then I think Ezra Pound said that Imagist poetry was about thinking of poems as like the musical phrase, not the metronome ticking over and over again. So it sort of has that conversation or that musical quality of a phrase where part of it rises, part of it falls. And this one line in here really stuck out to me when I was reading through it the other day. It's at the last sentence of point number 2. And it's, in poetry, a new cadence means a new idea.
Yeah.
And I thought that was so beautiful, and I thought that goes hand in hand with that, using common speech and the exact word. It's also a case of pairing the exact word with a particular cadence, a particular rhythm. And if you were to take a simple moment or a simple image and write a poem about it using similar words, or still using everyday speech, but in a new cadence, you've made it a new thing. How the changing the rhythm that something is expressed through makes it a new image, even if you're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, and then it goes to the idea that that what makes it new is our sense of relationship to it, right? And so we can, I mean, argue in modernist poetry, we're beginning to sort of experience that anxiety of, can we actually create anything new? And so, yeah, we can create something new, even if it's been looked at several times, because we can create a sense of newness through the sound that we write it in. And I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah. I always ignore number 2 because I've never really connected with it. But I like that. I think you brought life into that passage for me.
I've always found cadence is very important in my own writing, and I tend to always read my work out loud as part of the drafting process. Because I feel like that, unless I'm actually saying it out loud and not just in my own mind, but actually in my mouth and in the air, it just helps me understand it on a new level. And I think that that's one thing that also gets overlooked, because a lot of times when people focus on the Imagist sort of rules of not using the extra flowery language of romanticism, and a lot of that to focus on, like you said, word economy, but that's not necessarily meaning always fewer words equals better lines.
Right.
That word economy means nothing extra, but sometimes the exact word is adding some extra syllables so you can find the cadence of a line. You know, I've been in a lot of workshops where people are like, cut out all the ands and
I know.
and stuff like that, and it's like, why? You know, I mean, it's sometimes they're not necessary, but sometimes those little words are doing the work of creating the rising and falling of speech. You know, so in that case, those are the exact words you want. That is doing the work of having the economy of language, because you're working to fit that cadence.
Yeah, I think that's something that just like young writers have a tendency to do, is to overuse those sort of almost filler words, we could argue. But yeah, sometimes they're important because they bring us to the sense that the writer's trying to. So I think a lot of it too is about making sure it's being purposeful.
Yeah.
If that makes sense,
think, like,
that we're always aware of what this word is doing in this moment.
Yeah. And I think, like, I've heard then a lot of people take it too far the other way when they're like, absolutely, people just have a lot of filler words that on accident because they're not paying close attention to their word choice, or like editing, or editing. I don't like the word editing, but like they're not like revising purposely to find that rhythm, which I feel like the exact rhythm is something I often land on in the revision process. But then I find a lot of people then who get the advice to cut out those filler words, then go too far the other direction. So sometimes as much as I definitely challenge people when I'm giving feedback to take out a lot of that filler language. Also, sometimes if people are interested in exploring rhythms in their work, I'll give them the assignment of like, write a poem for me and say the word "and" as many times as you can in that poem.
Oh, that's really cool.
And I was like, how can you build a rhythm in the poem and just say "and" as many times as possible, still using like the rules of language and stuff like that, but just how can you explore new rhythms given the freedom of as many "ands" as you'd like? So.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for finally making me emotionally connect to number 2. Now I'm going to point that out for the rest of the time I teach this class. Like, what is the significance of "and", people? What is the significance? Cool. Well, are you comfortable with us now looking at Swan and Shadow?
Yeah, let's do it. What a great poem.
Yeah, and I can read this one out loud for us.
Yeah, lay it on us.
All right. Dusk. Above the water hang the loud flies. Here, oh so gray. Then what? A pale signal will appear. When? Soon before its shadow fades. Where? Here, in this pool of open eye. In us. No, upon us. As at the very edges of where we take shape in the dark air, this object bears its image awakening, ripples of recognition that will brush darkness up into light. Even after this bird, this hour, both drift atop the perfect sad instant now, already passing out of sight, toward yet untroubled reflection. This image bears its object darkening into memorial shades, scattered bits of light, no, of water, or something across water, breaking up, no, being regathered soon. Yet by then a swan will have gone, yes, out of the mind, into what vast, pale hush of a place past, sudden dark, as if a swan sang. Yeah.
That's such a beautiful poem.
Yeah, I actually remember the day I first saw this poem, and it was actually in the same class, and it was the same day that I learned the red wheelbarrow. And then we turned the page, and then I saw this poem, and I was just like, whoa. And it was like little high school Robyn. I was just like, oh my God. Like,
I mean, it definitely puts the red wheelbarrow to shame.
it doesn't put it to shame. I've since learned the love of the red wheelbarrow, but I was a very grumpy high schooler, right? And so I just remember like looking at this and being like, wow, language is limitless. And I remember that so much because I started, thinking that I would someday be a visual artist, and I still find a lot of like solace and meditation when I work in that form. But then, yeah, this might be one of the poems that like swayed me. I guess you could almost look at it. What's your reaction to it?
I mean, I think it works on a lot of levels. First, just on the level of the line, and I mean, just if we just like look at it's interesting, like this, because it's so focused on the shape of the poem on the page. It's easy to stop thinking about them as lines, which is because there's also sort of kind of what you're supposed to do a little bit is let that idea go of like what's the line, and so clearly, if you're trying to say something like, is this iambic pentameter? That doesn't fit this type of this type of thing. But if we just think of like the first sentence, I often don't think of this as like as sentences, but they do have sentences in there. So we can just think of the language of the sentence. The first sentence is, dusk above the water hang the loud flies. I guess dusk is the first sentence, but then above the water hang the loud flies. There's so like you're in a moment. It's a great example of just giving you the image and using those everyday words. None of those words are especially haughty words, but to have put them together, it becomes a beautiful image. And then, of course, I think the thing that makes this such an excellent poem, and the poem that everybody mentions if they're talking about concrete poetry, it's always this poem. It's like definitely this one. Is that it does such a good job of having the image that it makes on the page serve the purpose of the poem.
Yes. And
So
it's also not difficult to sense where to begin and end. I think is also important.
Yeah.
I love getting into sound, like you were talking about, like the call and response that we almost get between lines. What, a pale, when, soon, where, here, in us, no, upon us. And that to me just brings up that there's definitely a strong sense of the reliance of the line on either the line next to it or the space between the line and the following.
Yeah, one thing that I think is probably one of the most impressive things about this is the way that the writing makes you want to honor the pause of the white space. So, because in general, white space mid-line, so if on a single line, there's a gap, an extra big gap between some words, you want to give a bit of a pause there. And here, of course, we know there has to be white space to make the shape of the swan, but that the word choice makes you also want to give that white space a breath as you're moving to the next thing. Is really impressive. So I think go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Joe.
I think just that, of course, obviously, the way it uses the turn, right, of the swan is coming toward you in the beginning part, and then the middle line is the turn at the exact moment that it's right there, and then as you get into the reflection of the swan in the visual shape of the poem, then it's passing away. That moment is passing away. So I think this poem is really about kind of like the fleeting nature of things, and like how beautiful moments are, even though they're capturing a beautiful moment in a poem, how beautiful moments come and then disappear, and then just how the poem, the shape of the poem enacts that is what makes it so strong. Because I think like the question that gets asked a lot, and this is really related to what we were saying about the ands, like people will ask, well, if you're trying to find the exact words, what purpose is this word serving? What does it help the poem achieve its purpose in some way? And I think you can take that same logic and apply it to a choice to make a poem a concrete poem. Why did you give it this shape on the page? Is it just to do some visual trickery, or does it help you understand the poem on a deeper level? And I think this is one of the best examples I've ever seen of the shape on the page actually informing the ideas and emotional quality of the poem.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, and I think too, like, because we were talking about how like you can force language to fit form, and I have no idea how he was able to not make anything feel forced.
Oh yeah.
To create it, that it does, like you were talking about, like that a, that and, that in. It's all necessary, and none of it is superfluous. Yeah. I actually, when I read this poem, and I thought of it today while I was getting ready to call you, I was rereading Keats's letters collection that I have, and I came back to a passage where he writes on the mansion of many apartments. And so I wanted to read this just to sort of maybe help us finish our looking at Hollander's work. He writes, I compare human life to a large mansion of many apartments, two of which I can only describe the doors of the rest being as shut upon me. The first we step into we call the infant or thoughtless chamber, in which we remain as long as we do not think. We remain there a long while, and notwithstanding the doors of the second chamber remain wide open, showing the bright appearance. We care not to hasten to it, but are at length imperceptibly impelled by awakening of the thinking principle within us. We no sooner get into the second chamber, which I shall call the chamber of maiden thought, then we become intoxicated with the light and the atmosphere. We see nothing but pleasant wonders, and think of delaying there forever in delight. However, among the effects this breathing is father of that tremendous one of sharpening one's vision into the nature and heart of man, of convincing one's nerves that the world is full of misery and heartbreak, pain, sickness, and oppression, whereby this chamber of maiden thought becomes gradually darkened, and at the same time on all sides of it many doors are set open, but all dark, all leading to dark passages. We see not the balance of good and evil. We are in the midst. We are now in that state. We feel the burden of the mystery. And so it's like, for me, it's so beautifully sort of like deals with what Keats is getting at in his letter, because we first see the thing and it's beautiful and perfect in its state. And you can even argue, like when you see the swan, and it reflects perfectly the same image of itself beneath itself, that sense of that moment is so transitional. And then we get into then the dark memory, the dark and sort of drift by atop the perfect sad instant now, already passing out of sight toward yet untroubled reflection, this image bears its object darkening. For me, it is like it becomes a memory, but it becomes not the naturalness and perfect moment that it was in that fleeting observation, and then it becomes this darkened memory that we can recall.
I feel like there's such a tension in this poem, which is one of the things that I love about it, and I think it's the tension of just experiencing anything lovely, you know. Even in the beginning, you know, I think there's something about setting it at dusk, setting it in a the first word is about time as much as it's about setting, you know. Even in the beginning, when we know that the image is coming toward us, when the thing is about to be experienced, we have the knowledge that it'll be temporary. And then, you know, even as we hold the memory, we know that the moment has passed. So, like, even the sweetest part of the experience always has that little lingering knowledge that it's going to be gone. And on one hand, that's always sort of like a pang of melancholy in the midst of joy. But on the other hand, I feel like that's also what allows the moment to be beautiful. You know, because if you really could hang on to it forever, then it would lose its beauty. You know.
Definitely become commonplace.
And I think that takes us right back to to this is just to say, you know, like, part of what allowed the plums to taste so good is that you've run out.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yes, that is gone.
Yeah. If you had, he would not have written that poem if they had, you know, a bushel of plums.
Yeah. No, because that's beautiful, Joe. Well, just as no poem is ever finished, it's only abandoned. I feel like we need to abandon.
Let's abandon this. Yeah.
You want to read? Sorry.
Go ahead. I would say I want to hear you read the Anecdote in the Jar.
Okay.
Because I know that this is a meaningful poem to you, and the one that you return to again and again. So I really want to hear this in your voice.
Okay. Anecdote of the Jar. I placed the jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness around that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was gray and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. Yeah. And this poem, it does, like you were saying, like that like the idea of, for me, when I read it, it always reminds me of like of the influence that language has over us, in a sense, because the invasion of the jar, the placement of the jar, it rearranges all things to be in connection to it, right? And like we go back to like word choice, like slovenly. I love that word.
Yeah.
Because it's wild, it's chaotic, there's a sense of it being dirty, but not dirty as like negative as much, but like natural, right? And so it's like, it made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill.
And it also works on the sounds because you have the two L's in slovenly, and they really work within wilderness.
Yeah.
You're coming off the L's in hill, and you go back to hill. So.
But yet, like, the beginning of the poem to me has just such a natural presentation of speech. Like, I could hear Matt Johnstone, like, just saying this to me as I'm, like, sitting on a hill with him in the middle of the wilderness in Tennessee. And it would be like, oh, yeah, that's just, like, he's just talking. But then, like, midway through the poem, we have this huge shift where the jar was round upon the ground. And that's an internal rhyme.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of a sudden, because the jar is there, and because it's now tamed the wilderness, like, language is now tamed and organized in a sense. Because we have air everywhere and there. But then we come back to the wilderness, right? And then it did not give a bird or bush, which is alliteration, which has a sense of rhyme, but still, like, what I love about alliteration is that it wakes me up out of, like, my headspace that I'm in, but it doesn't feel patterned, if that makes sense. It's like a sense of a natural pattern. I also just, like, love alliteration, so it's, like, my own weird thing. But, like, did not give a bird or bush, like, nothing else in Tennessee. And so we, like, abandoned rhyme.
Yeah, the last line really takes it back to just you see, it starts building up that, like, the inline rhyme and the rhymes between lines, and then the last line is just like, nope, we're back. We're just getting rid of all the rhyme, all the there's no alliteration. It's just, and it's back to, like, line one of just ordinary
stuff. The authenticity, it's like we abandon the jar. And we come back to, it's so much for me, like, it's something that I think about this probably an unhealthy amount. And my students are probably also tired of me talking about this, but it's like the very first time that we experienced fear, you know? Like, you felt that like crippling, the chest tightening, the heart palpitating, the elongation of time that you experience when you're first afraid. Like, the time is almost not present. I'm just at the will of this sensation. And then we learn that's fear. And so you are afraid. And you'll still, like, come back to the authenticity of what you felt in that first moment, but you know what it is. So because I know what it is, I can control what it is, and it's not, like, free for me to just be lost in. And like, that's for me, that's so much what the jar represents, because when you're just out in the woods, and I think it's beautiful that it's Tennessee, because Tennessee is so rich and green that you become, like, overwrought with that sense of green, where everything is just green, if that makes sense. But then there's this jar. And so I was like, oh, that's what stands out. And it's like, oh, and now everything is near the jar, because the jar is not natural. The jar was invented. Yeah.
You mentioned that reading, even though you read this poem a million times, that one time you were reading it during a class and you had a revelation about it. You realized something about it in the moment of reading it in a class. What did you realize?
I realized the first rhyme scheme. Yeah, and it's like, for me, it was like, the jar was round upon the ground. And I was like, man, that is how much control that the jar has on the poem. That once we're looking at the jar is no longer natural. The jar is just this presence that never leaves us until we get the hell out of the jar and we get and it's like, whoa, what, like, and I'm not a rhyme person. Really, like, my students will know that like, rhyme sometimes can really bother me because unless you're really good at it, it can make poems feel adolescent, right?
Yeah.
Or cliched. And so I don't ever look for rhyme, and if I notice it, it usually makes me not appreciate it as much. And so the fact that for me, I like, again, I'd been teaching the poem for I think like 2 years at that point, and then I came in the middle of class. I was like, round upon the ground, and I told so many students not to, like, well, round and ground, that's kind of a throwaway. But he uses it in a sense that it slipped past me for so long, and then I was like, yeah.
Again, so this great example of again, those images principles of exact words, because nothing in that sentence is I don't think for the most part, I think the idea of difficult words is sort of a myth. It's more of like what we convince ourselves is difficult. Once you know what a word means, one is the same as the next. But as far as difficulty, usually, but still, they're ordinary words that you hear every day, but they're chosen in a very purposeful way, to really get into what he's trying to examine in this poem.
Yeah, I call them $5 words. You got to make sure that those $5 words feel purposeful, because you purchase a lot with that one word. And so, but then slovenly that is the word for right there.
Yeah.
There's no
well, I was just gonna say that's slovenly is a good. It's $5 well spent.
Yeah, that's a good $5 word. Like you got your money's worth out of that one. It's doing so much.
Yeah.
And it's also not patterned, just like the wilderness. There's not we talk a lot about how when we use one word, when we use the word love, we also bring up the concept of hate, because there's just such a clear connection to the binary in those two, to where in a sense, extreme love can almost appear to be same as extreme hate, if we could maybe even go that far. But slovenly doesn't have, if I say chaos, I think orderly or organized or patterned. But slovenly, what is the binary of slovenly? It's not as easy for me to draw up, and so that also makes that sense of being lost within the disorganized, charted landscape even more being lost. Right? Because I don't have that familiarity to hang on to. And so it's like, again, and it's just a beautiful poem. And it's crazy to me too, because I love this poem so much. I started reading up on Wallace Stevens, and this is the Wallace Stevens poem for me, at least of his canonized work, because Emperor of Ice Cream still drives me crazy. I don't know why we teach that poem to students, but his writing, his actual the way that he would write poems down is he would speak them out loud to his secretary, and his secretary would write them down, and then at the end of the month he would ask for his poems, and he'd go through and he'd revise a couple of them, and he'd throw other ones away.
That's crazy. So she even kind of made the initial, unless he was dictating line breaks, I bet she had a lot of creative input on those poems that people don't recognize, because that's a big part of creating the rhythm and the cadence of the poem.
And did she put line breaks in? And if she did, you're right. And that she's like, she should be credited. So who are you, mystery secretary?
I know.
Secretary.
I know.
Yeah. What comes to your
you,
mind when we look at this psalm?
What comes? I mean, kind of, similar to what you were saying. I think I also was just noticing that the way the jar imposes itself upon the landscape. And then I know that when I first read this, the last line where you sort of start to get into the rhymes, but then the last line does not resolve the rhyme. It sticks out because it goes back to the unstructured quality. Oh, I hated that.
Yeah.
Like when I was high school, me just like, oh, that was the splinter in my eye. I couldn't take it, and I think there were a lot of things that a lot of poets writing kind of around the time of Wallace Stevens or before, who would even people who would be doing formal poems, but would have lines where they don't obey the meter. That would just it used to bother me until someone pointed out to me that people would do that on purpose as a way of, even within obeying like a form or within a rhyme scheme, as a way of like stopping you in a moment or calling particular attention to a line, just sort of saying like, this is something you're not allowed to just move beyond. And I think that gave me a new level of respect for a lot of lines of poetry that I had in the past thought of as the weakest lines. Now I'm like, oh, this is they're right. It does make it stay with me in a way that initially I didn't want it to, because I was like, I hate this. But now I'm appreciating it on a whole other level.
Yeah. I feel like that was like how I felt about the Red Wheelbarrow, and then I had to come back to it and be like, oh my God, yeah. So much dust rests upon. God damn.
I said, do you want to look at Valentine?
Yes, I am. And then can we conclude with your poem, There's a Girl, Some Girls, a Girl?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds
wonderful.
Good. So you read two, so I guess this one's my turn. Let me do Valentine here. And with this great first line, there's nothing like that first line. So, cherry plums suck a week's soak. Overnight they explode into the scenery of before your touch. The curtains open on the end of our path. Pink trumpets on the vines bear to the hummingbirds. Butterflies unclasp from their purse of their couplings. They light and open on the doubled hands of the eucalyptus fronds. They sip from the pistils for 7 generations that bear them through another tongue as the first year of our punishing mathematic begins clicking the calendar forward. They land like seasoned rocks on the decks of cliffs. They take another turn on the spiral of life, where the blossoms blush and pale in a day of dirty dawn, where the ghost of you webs your limbs through branches of cherry plum. Rare bird, extinct color, you stay in my dreams in X-ray. In rerun, the bone of you, stripping sweethearts, folds in layers the shedding petals of my grief into decayed holograms, my forever empty art.
Had you read this poem before I sent it to you, Joe?
I think a long time ago. It was a great way to get back in touch with it.
Yeah, I mean, and like, the reason I teach like imagism, and then sort of the class is structured where we start from the past, and then we look at like a more modern presentation of it. And so it's the reason that I look at how maybe we get from imagism into concrete poetry. But this one, it's like arguable, is it a concrete poem or is it an imagist poem?
Well, first, I mean, it's got the half heart, right? So, I mean, it is a concrete poem because I think it's clear that that's purposeful. But is it only a concrete poem? You know, I mean, obviously, it can be in many camps at once.
Yeah.
I think for me, the first line totally exemplifies the imagist principles that are laid out in the Lowell preface. You know, so cherry plums suck a week's soak. Yeah, none of those are $5 words. But I don't think anyone would read that line and say that's not a line of poetry.
Yeah.
You know, and just like the way it uses sounds and all the sounds just enact the thing too. Like it feels wet. I feel like I get extra aware of how wet the inside of my mouth is when I read that line. You know. So it's just a great example of being purposeful about choosing words to I mean, one, it's just giving the image, but also just tapping into, and this like another side of the image, which is like the quality of wetness, the almost like tactile quality of having been out and everything feeling soggy right after the rain.
A line that just forever stands out to me is, and rerun the bone of you, stripping sweethearts, fold layers of shedding petals of my grief into a decayed hollow gram. Oh, and like that line break to me, I think is just so perfectly and intimate that we end with the decayed hollow. That's like the half heart, like that sound of it, and then we come to gram. That it's now this sort of like false representation. Yeah.
So it's interesting, like that, right around that part of the poem, I feel like there's an important turn, right? Because I think in the first part, it's all, we're getting all images, you know, we're getting all images of like the butterflies and the hummingbirds and the trumpet vines. And then right around here, we start getting this more the addressing the you of the poem. And it still uses these images because I would say like the folds and layers and shedding petals are sort of images, but they're more abstract statements, trying to get into some meaning, some emotional quality of the poem. And I was just curious what you thought about who do you think this you is addressing? I was thinking about that a lot as I was reading this time through.
For me, the first time I read it as it being the loss of the lover. But since I've been teaching it, I had a student actually point out that for them, they thought it was more the loss of the parent that they were most connected to. And so I think that is the you of the poem. Pale in the day of dirty dawn, where the ghost of you weds your limbs through branches of cherry plum. Yeah. I don't know. Whoever the you is, they're beautiful.
Yeah, I think the first time I initially always just thought it was the lover, right? I mean, I feel like that's a pretty clear interpretation with the Valentine. Also, just throwing it out there, I love having poems that have more than one valid interpretation, like and just not trying to invalidate any of them and say that any one is the right one. That's something that Image's poems allow us to do more than some previous things that really went out of their way to explain, like, this is the story I'm telling. It's from classical literature. This is what you know about it. You know.
Well, I'm a firm believer in Whitman. You know, where he says, "Come and loaf with me on the grass, and I will give you. Have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you felt so good to get at the meaning of poems? Come, and I will give to you the origin of all poems. You will not take them at second hand from me either. Instead, you will filter them through yourself." You know, and that's why I think Image's poetry is it's why it stands the test of time, because it welcomes the reader to do that. The poet is very aware that it is the act of reading this poem, and that I'm comfortable with someone reading this poem and finding meaning through themselves instead of me giving it to you. Yeah. But again, the plum is that sexy image. Like, that's that we can back to a plum.
The plum is in here.
And the Valentine itself.
I was thinking, I think one thing that occurred to me this time through, and it might have been because I was already like reading this in mind that we would be having this conversation for class, but it occurred to me, I think I was really getting stuck on the very end, the criticism of one's own art as empty, and I think that could easily be seen as like just, it's not, it can't hold on to this person who I lost. But as I was reading and rereading this poem, I was also sort of thinking of this as a little bit of, it could be a poem addressing the art. You know? So the you is kind of like the desire to create poetry.
Yeah.
And in that sense, the beginning has all these like just the images and just the giving the images, but then the desire to create a poem sort of filters its way through all the things that you're seeing. And I don't know about you, but I definitely had these moments where I am out and about and I'm like in a lovely spot and I'm like, maybe I should write something about this. And sometimes it's perfect. Like, you know, with like when I was writing on the freeway, you know, because I saw the truck, it was just great. I wrote it. I was so happy. But then other times I'm like, I feel almost this like I should be writing about this, and it ruins my ability to just be in the moment.
Yeah.
And so I was just rereading this as a possible interpretation. Again, not arguing that it's the interpretation, but just how that desire to be a person who uses language is the you in the poem. That the desire to create a poem and how that desire to be writing kind of filters its way through all of the ways that you perceive the images around you. And then, you know, some days it feels very gratifying. Other days it feels like a hologram.
Yeah, that's so true. Like, I could never really recreate the beauty of which I was experiencing, and so why try? Yeah, that's cool. I like reading this as an art poetic poem. Yeah, it's because it's like a dark art poetic poem. It's not celebrating the art of poetry, but instead it's being sort of, it's recognizing your inability to actually even create the beauty of this thing. Oh,
it's like this.
cool.
It's sort of like it was a poem conceived of on one of the bad days when this person was like, nothing is working out for me, but then they just like revised it to the point that it kind of came back around.
Yeah. And that's how important revision is, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I'm gonna start before you, and we are gonna have to abandon Lorna G.
Yeah,
Cervantes.
it's time. We've been chatting for a while.
We have, yeah. It's been a beautiful talk, though. Thank you so much, Joe. Like, thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It was so much fun to just kind of go back, and I know some of these are poems that I've read many times, other ones not so much, but just to have the challenge of like looking at them again, and just paying close attention to them again was lovely.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to end all of our podcast editions with a free writing exercise. So we're keeping we're having to write 3 poems a week, one in form, one is form specific, one is theme specific, and then one is dealer's choice. And so we're also adding these free writing poem exercises now, since we won't be in class where I make everyone write poems. But it was rumored that This Is Just to Say was actually perhaps a found poem that William Carlos Williams constructed. Now, I don't know if that's true, and I don't need to know if it's true. But I think it could be an interesting exercise if we created found poems using only these 4 poems that we've discussed today. And I'm going to add to it and say we can include your 2 poems as well to be broken up and used to write our own found poem.
Yeah.
So found poem is a type of poetry where you create the poem using words, phrases, and sometimes whole passages from other sources and reframing them. In a sense, it's the literary equivalent of making a collage. So, with that being said, thank you so much. You brought so much new perspective into our work, and I can only imagine how boring it would be if you had to listen to just me talk about poetry every day for the rest of the
I don't know. It could be good.
Well, I've appreciated the life that you've breathed into it, and I would love to conclude with your poem, There's a Girl, Some Girl, The Girl.
All right. So, let's give it a shot. There's a girl, some girl, the girl. She's on a beach with sand and water, and there are birds, 4 birds, watching the sand and the girl and the beach, and maybe hoping for fish. The girl doesn't see the birds or me. She does not know the distant pier. It's wood. She knows the sand and the water and their mud love, and between her toes she sees with her feet, and the wind in her hair, heavy with ocean.
Oh, this is the perfect way to end class. In their mud love. That's going to be my phrase that I come back to for the rest of this week. Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Joe Kane. And I'll be sure to make my students aware of where they can find more information about the porch and about Slant, and then also about you. So
absolutely, I appreciate it. I'm sure we'll cross paths again soon. Thanks for chatting about poems with me on a Sunday, and so definitely find out more about the porch, and if you know anyone in 3rd through 12th grade, we got programs all kinds of writing. Perfect for people who are just discovering writing for the first time or have already filled journals up with a million ideas. So a great way to get going. But then also definitely a wealth of things for adults, and all the stuff through the porch is all focused on creating your own writing. So wherever the starting place is, it always leads to creating some of your own writing by the time you're done.
All right. Well, awesome. Thank you, Joe. And I'm
It's
sure
been
I'll
a
talk to you
pleasure.
soon.
Take care, Robyn.
Bye. Have a wonderful Sunday. Bye.
You too.